Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Ishaq, for having me here. Indeed, this is actually unusual for me because I'm often either invited to talk about Lebanon or invited to talk about the center. What Ishaq asked me to do is to talk about the Lebanon through the eyes of the center, which at the beginning I thought, wow, it's so easy, I'll just combine them, I'll have a presentation, but actually it'll have to be much more difficult, actually, to sort of integrate both issues in a way that sort of unpack what's actually in my head and actually put it in writing. So I'm just gonna focus on two particular issues here, and I'm going to rely on the slides because there's some information and data that actually might be useful. Is really look at two major themes, two major questions that I'd like to sort of answer. Is that how we do policy research, really, and how we have influenced policy making, essentially. And I'm going to look at four sort of cases to illustrate how we've done that. One's about improved political representation, strengthen decentralization and local governments, creating jobs, and develop the oil and gas sector. And I'm going to take the liberty to maybe fast forward at some point, so I don't need to get into a lot of details, but feel free to actually interrupt, given we're a small group, to ask any specific questions you have. I'll be glad to sort of take that as well. So, but really, these two questions are very much, as Ishaq said, really interrelated, because in a way, to ask the second question, how we have influenced policymaking, you're assuming you have a position on what you want to influence them on. What's your position on that? And to have a position, you need to have done your policy research. And to do policy research requires all sets of tools that you need to have sort of under your feet to actually be able to do that. So they're very much interrelated, and I cannot imagine that you can have one without the other, although many maybe tend to sort of undermine the first one, and I don't think they give it a lot of weight as they ought to. They think, oh, we can just simply lobby the government for something, But I tend to disagree with that sort of approach. And we're operating, sort of to give you a context here, very briefly, we're operating in a highly polarized country, whether it's from a political perspective in terms of the two major camps, or from a sectarian base. As you know, Lebanon is highly sectarian, and where political identities in Lebanon are actually defined by sects. So each sect, which means the Shias, the Sunnis, the Maronite, and what have you, have their own political parties, and they actually express their views through that. And you've got the policy-making process is very much restricted to the political elite, to these parties, which are largely clientelistic, and hence there's no programs to debate, no sort of, programs to challenge, or if they do have programs, they're actually never implemented, and they're never actually held accountable to these programs. And for the center, one issue about funding, we're operating in a situation where we don't have an endowment as a center, so we're operating in a very sort of flux environment where we're very much donor-based. We'll get our grants and money from all sort of, mostly international donors. In fact, we don't get any money from inside Lebanon, from any institution. And that's not, partly it's by design because we don't want to be captured by any group. What we've been recently doing is fundraising, meaning holding fundraising dinners and have rich Lebanese contribute money, but you want to have many of them contributing small amount of money, so that would help you. So that's something we've been moving into recently. And then when you think of research, really, we don't have a lot of data. That's a major problem. And how do you actually create or generate your own data to be able to say something useful? And all of that to, in fact, have sort of independence and credibility of sort. So the plan of the talk is to give you a quick snapshot on Lebanon, essentially, and then move to the two questions that will sort of shape the whole presentation. So, as I mentioned, very quickly again, this is important because we understand the political system, because essentially when we're trying to influence policy, we're not operating in a system where the policy making is transparent and open and open for participation. And there's no formal mechanism where think tanks or civil societies are actually involved. We have all the infrastructure of what political institutions look like in America or in Europe, but they're sort of fast forward. They go to some legislations, like yesterday, in fact, in Lebanon, they passed 3 or 4 legislations in no time. whereas no one has been given sort of enough time to actually either reflect on them or to actually have interest groups actually voice their concerns. Maybe some interest groups have voiced, particularly religious leaders on certain issues, for example. And as I mentioned earlier, that the policy-making process is very much dominated by political parties. And then this is very general, and it applies to pre-Civil War and either post-Civil War. And when the Civil War sort of took place, and the post-Civil War sort of equation was to leave pretty much everything intact, particularly on the sectarian level, just shift the power, balance of power between the president and the prime minister and the council of ministers, but it didn't really affect policy-making process from, as think tanks we care about. So in that sense, they've got shuffling from above. That means the president becomes less powerful, but the council of ministers become more powerful and becomes the executive. The parliament speaker becomes more powerful, and you have that shift on the sort of horizontal level, but from the vertical level in terms of sort of people, constituency, civil society affecting the horizontal, that it's actually didn't change. Now, in the meantime, what has happened, which is interesting, is at the end of the war was 1989. It was actually at the same time that the center was actually established, 1989. And the founders back then, they were very much frustrated by the poor policy that the earlier generation sort of didn't bother to advance. And this is when they felt like it was way too important for them to ignore policy-making process, to just keep it in the circles of political parties. And the idea was to actually design and develop or set up a think tank, is actually to do non-partisan research and actually try to advocate for change. So that was sort of really what became eventually a hub for the secular-minded, particularly Lebanese who were abroad, came back very much frustrated by the political system, and this sort of served that as a hub where a lot of us, in fact, and this is when Ishaq met me back in 1997, or at least I was there from 1997 to 2000, it actually formed. It was really an interesting place to be, because we would go there and we were very much enthusiastic because we thought we were going to a lab, essentially, working on Lebanon. We're in Lebanon, but working on Lebanon. So it was really an island of, positive thinking, at least secular-minded, policy-oriented, and we're sort of trying to observe what's happening outside and trying to figure out how we can intervene or how we can make a change. So it's so in a way it was really a great place to be in many ways. Now, let me start with the first question, is sort of how we work and how we've evolved from that, because I think this is sort of important to actually see. I've really tried to break down, essentially, this is moving. Okay, so maybe I should take this. All right, so the system goes as follows. I think it's okay. We'll fix this up. So I was thinking about it when I came here. It's like, okay, so what do we do? How we do what we do? And I think there are 4 steps, in fact, when we do research, for policy research. One is that actually we identify the issues. What do we think is important? This could be either something on the table that the government is discussing, or something that's not on the table that we think is important and we want to put it on the table. And here, in fact, decentralization, election, electoral law, formed the pillar of the center. As early as 1993, the center was already leading the way, leading these initiatives on how to move into PR system, for example, in electoral law versus the majoritarian system, or pushing for local government. So identifying the issues here is really, really key issue. So this is sort of, in a way, identifying your research question and what you think is important. But then once you do that, is to really see how you want to approach this. How do you actually get to understand the problem, and before you come up with solutions. And the center, I think, here in the early years, when it started, we really knew nothing about Lebanon post-war. Back in the 90s, our first books, that we've published were highly descriptive. We're trying to understand whether about elections, how people vote, or essentially local governments. There were no local governments back then either. So they were highly descriptive. What we're doing now, when I sort of assumed the leadership of the center, is that I thought, well, wait a minute, we can no longer do the descriptive stuff. We need to be much more analytical, and we need to sort of rely on much more sort of either quantitative sort of analysis, generating data, doing focus groups to help us write the questionnaires, or doing focus groups after we write the questionnaires to understand the findings, or we do control groups and treatment groups, and so forth. This is sort of new at the center. Earlier we were much more sort of really describing how things sort of work. Now we're much more, in one of the topics we did, for example, we had to create sort of assess the impact, for example, of instability on the Lebanese economy. In fact, how would you do that? Because there's only one Lebanon, and it's hard to actually measure that. So we had one of our researchers do a synthetic control and try to see what Lebanon looks like. And I think Lebanon, when we did that, was, if my memory is correct, was 3/4 Croatian and 1/4 Maltese. So in fact, that's actually Lebanon in many ways pre-instability. And then you try to compare how the GDP growth would actually have evolved in these countries and compare it to Lebanon. And I think our study showed that Lebanon loses 5%, or lost that during this year, 5% of GDP due to that instability. So that sort of thing that pushes us to actually think about these issues. And then we create forums for discussions, obviously through workshops, conferences. And again, here we've moved at the center. In the earlier part of the center, we just have workshops or conferences. They're open. We bring a lot of intellectuals, activists, and we have meetings and discussions, which I think are very, very useful because you create critical mass of people that are sort of really concerned about these issues. Now we're actually much more, I would say, selective in the sense that we have closed meetings, many more closed meetings with government agencies, for example, on specific issue. And I'm going to discuss that, particularly with the oil and gas sector. We're working very closely with the Lebanese Petroleum Administration, where we hold roundtable discussions with them and 20 or 25 economists or civil society on specific themes. And we think that actually bridges a better understanding of how things operate and in terms of sharing that knowledge. And clearly, at the end of the day, we publish books and what have you. So yeah, if you want to sort of, publish many books and many policy papers, but I think what's important to realize that books and papers are very important. They sort of serve us, they give us the opportunity to think about issues, but in fact, they never get your points across because policymakers don't read, people don't read generally. So we moved to policy brief, which is like a 4-pager, which is nice, and I realized that actually not many people read the policy briefs, In fact, related to that, one of the policies when I took over, I said, okay, you know what, enough of this printing stuff. We print everything, and we have a whole, storehouse, and we pay whatever money because we have all these books and so forth. I said, stop reading, let's go digital. Everything's online, and then which makes sense to everyone, right? And then actually 6 months ago, I reversed that policy, and I started printing every single event brief, every single policy brief, and I'll put the package and send them to the parliament, to the 128 MPs, and put them in their mailbox. And surprisingly, I started getting calls from the MPs thanking me for sending them these policy briefs, because a lot of them don't read emails, some don't even have emails, So I realized that actually to communicate with these people, you still have to go the old way, And one parliamentarian said, "It's so nice you have these policy briefs. Even the first page, it has the executive summary, so I don't even have to turn the page to actually read beyond that." I was like, brilliant. I hope you read the executive summary at least. So let's sort of give you a sense of what we're up against in terms of communicating the ideas even once they're actually out. So here are 4. They look like billiards, but there's a logic to them that I'm going to sort of quickly go through. I guess these are sort of 5 major themes that we're working on in Lebanon right now, from political representation in red to decentralization in brown, jobs creation, reducing instability, which I'll very quickly go through, and the oil and gas sector. And so here's the issue. One of the issues that in Lebanon that we've been fighting for many years, as I said as early as 1993, is sort of the electoral law. We have a major problem in the system, the way it works right now. It's majoritarian based, and it's what we call every 4 years Lebanon changes its electoral law. So it's like perfect case of gerrymandering. People in power, once they're there, redesign, redraw the districts in such a way that actually ensures their elections. And in fact, I would probably argue that actually politicians actually select their voters, not the voters selecting their politicians, because in this case, you've designed it in such a way that you remove any competition. And in fact, if you look at the electoral results, in fact, you're only out of 25, 27, depending on each whatever year, that actually number of competitive districts are very, like, probably 3 to 4 major, if so, competitive. Like Babda, like Zahle, maybe a couple of others, but that's it. All the other ones we know who's going to win, pretty much. So, and they're designed in such a way. I mean, this is how you keep people in power, essentially. They keep each other in power, in many ways. And then, so we've been working on this for many years. The first two, vote counting, gerrymandering, trying to lobby, unsuccessfully, I should say, because the Lebanese Center has been involved in even drafting the law, or one of the draft laws in 2005. And basically now we've built a coalition, and there's a whole coalition now that actually goes meets with parliamentarians, that other civil society organizations are doing. We actually decided we very much support them, but we moved on in terms of policy research. And we started focusing on electoral behavior and how people behave, how people vote and why they vote the way they are voting. And we started looking at vote buying, and sort of the clientelism, because we very, very much believe that even if you change the law, the sort of behavioral issues and the clientelism, sometimes I think we overemphasize in Lebanon the sectarian dimension, and I think it's very out there, but I think the clientelism and clientelistic relationship is probably even stronger than the clientelistic relationship.
What's
because,
clientelism?
Sorry?
What's
Clientelism is in fact when you vote for someone in return for a private good that you get, not your community, that you get personally. Okay? So it could be cash, or it could be voucher for something that I give you in return for your vote. So here we moved on, and we decided actually to start looking at the issue in terms of understand how this vote buying takes place, to understand this linkage between politicians and voters, looking at core voters, swing voters, looking at what sort of goodies people get, high value added, high value goods, low value goods. Low value goods means cash. High value is probably a job, So it depends, and who gets what, core voter versus swing voter. When do you get it? Do you get it before the election? No, you get it way before the election, or in election season, or all sorts of things to understand how this sort of mechanics works. And this is just to sort of share with you sort of what the literature is saying on this. People like Kitchens and Wilkinson, Stokes, and the debate sort of goes on between core and if you notice, some people say core. Some people say core voters, and then say, no, it's really swing voters. No, it's swing. No, it's a ping pong sort of thing. And in fact, our contribution on this as a very modest center, we don't think the debate is between swing and core. In fact, that's what the problem with the literature. I think that the swing gets something and the core gets something, but they get different type of things. Because here, all the assumptions are getting the same goodie. So you have this $1, do you give it to the core because he's a core, he's a loyalist, or you give the dollar to the swing, so he changes his vote and votes for you. That's the debate, essentially what it is. And we're saying, wait a minute, why are you assuming there's one good that's being divided, or not being divided, you're selecting? So we're saying no. It's actually it's a menu of goods. And in fact, we ran some focus groups on that. And you sit in these focus groups, and they tell you, and this Haki just reminded me of the survey, you're telling me, oh, they all despise politicians, they hate them, you sit in these focus groups, you feel like a revolution is going to take place right now, right there, and then 15 minutes into that, they vent out, they get it out of the system, and they say, of course we get money, of course we will get paid. In fact, I get paid for more than one, and they are so much into the whole system, it's incredible. So on one hand, it's in a way, could be, that there's an equilibrium that they'd love to be at, but they cannot. That throws them into a bad equilibrium of sorts. You want to think of it as equilibrium. So in fact, how do you get them to move from this equilibrium to that is a whole different challenge. But in fact, they all tell you, oh, it's really, really bad. We want to be here, But then they all sort of very much keep that bad equilibrium alive and persistent. So here at the center we've launched sort of 3 studies that we're looking at. One study looks at sort of what kind of groups. So here, and by the way, what the literature misses out is that they don't really distinguish between inducements and threats. They all focus on inducements, that this is what goodies you're going to get. But they don't tell you very much about the threats of not getting the goodie if you don't vote for him. So if you don't vote for Michel Mur, you might not get pure water. Seriously. And like in your area, your vote somehow gets cut out. You know, and because so it's actually about it's not only focusing on the benefits that you get from voting for this person, is the threat of not voting for him. So and then after that we look at, this is what we mean by a menu of cash to jobs. There's a whole menu, and it's the same one here replicated between low end and high end and so forth. So we're looking at who gets what type of goods. Another study we're looking at the mechanism of distributing the goods and the role of political brokers. And in English it sounds really cool, political brokers, but in fact, مفاتيح انتخابية in Arabic. So they could be the mukhtar or real estate agent, or these are sort of the ones who actually do the bids of the political parties. They go, they know the districts, they know everyone, they know whose fathers passed away, so they inform the policymaker so he can go to the funeral. So he has a directory of numbers. Some of them are in-house. That means they are part of the political parties. Some are contracted, and the political parties compete for them. There's some, like I say, the Aoun is competing with the Lebanese forces, like the Fatih Intikhabi work in some areas have shifted, all sort of things. So here we're actually, and we found out that actually the best time to study those people is in fact in the non-election season. Before they get all ganged up and ready to go at it. So we're looking at it as I speak. In fact, actually, to be more accurate, in 2 weeks we've designed a questionnaire, and it's actually being about to.
What kind of methods you use?
This is qualitative, face-to-face interviews. Yeah, it's very much so. You know what I mean? That we've designed it. We divided it into 4 or 5 themes that we're looking into, about the profile, for example, about what kind of goods they gave out. About how, and in fact, I should say, it's preceded by a questionnaire or a meeting with the political party to see how they work with their brokers, and then we move to the brokers themselves. But this is very much qualitative. And the idea, I think it's hard for bringing this up, because the idea is, ideally what we want to do is to do a survey, and quantitative survey. But we never, and this is one of the agony of funding, essentially. No funder gives you all. I mean, this was one whole project I have in my head, but no one funder is actually interested or understands what I'm doing. So I get a funder, seriously, I get a funder say, look, Sami, I have $20,000 to spend it before the year, what do I do? I was like, I'll do focus groups for that, knowing that it's part of a bigger puzzle that I have. And you'd be surprised how funders work, even German funders. So that's how we secure money for the green study, the mechanisms. In fact, this one was also another one that also by the Germans were funding this. And here we got money to do with the EU. So all these 3 studies sort of, are actually linked up in our hands. The funder doesn't really necessarily know that, but this is where we're going with our research, essentially, to figure out what's going on. So here are like sort of back to like my billiard board, what have you. So we're looking at these 3 things. I mean, who gets what kind of goods, how the brokers work, and I'm going to look a little bit about how youth find jobs in Lebanon, which is sort of an example. And Ishaq, maybe you need to warn me about time.
Yeah, maybe another 10 minutes.
Another 10 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll give you this example, and I'll jump to the second question. It's best. So the World Bank came up with this report maybe a year ago, I forgot, or almost a year ago, that they said youth unemployment in Lebanon is 24%, that Lebanese economy doesn't create enough jobs, we know that, and only 3,000 jobs are created. Again, that confirms other studies, and 85% of Lebanese find jobs through family and friends. And that also confirms other studies. I think there's another statistic which shows 70, and another one, the Arab barometer, shows up to maybe 90% or 93%. But clearly, there's something there about family and friends. And they said, okay, look, this is at the end of the day, it reduces search costs, but doesn't maximize the matching of skills. And granted, so what we wanted to do at the center is actually, what is really, how do you unpack family and friends? So we attempted to sort of look at this and look at, and actually, Mira, you actually worked with us on this. Mira was working for a consulting firm called Consultation Research Institute. Kamal Hamdan, essentially. So Kamal's group did the survey for us, and Mira participated in the brainstorming of these questions. Remember, Mira?
Yes.
Funny enough. So we trying to actually, one of the struggles is to actually divide it between social connections and political connections. And we wanted to know sort of, who resorts to social connections and who resorts to political connections. And does that have, what sort of profile of people? And because we thought that this may have some implications. So we conducted focus groups to get a feel of that. And again, we sit down in these focus groups and people tell you, we designed the focus group in such a way that we're really careful to be sensitive about it, not to mention the word wasta, which is sort of connection, sort of might offend people. And really, I mean, in no time, in a few minutes, people were saying, we all use wasta, wasta is great, we need to use wasta, wasta is connections, essentially, to get a job. And really, very, very, very few people had any sort of considerably negative focus. Wasta is the right way to go. So, and the survey was conducted of 300 students. And then when we look at it, we realized, okay, so social connections is pretty the second in line of 58% use social connections, which is very normal. I think we all use social connections. I mean, political connections is here. And in fact, we did a list experiment here. We divided our sample, which is 300, to two, 150 and 150. And in one of them, we removed because we wanted to see if people actually hide. In fact, it actually gets boosted by 10% if you compare the two samples. So because people might undermine or underreport the fact that we use political connections. But just to move quickly on this, we wanted to see what sort of implication it has. And clearly, the richer you are, the more likely you use social connections. But essentially, people whose fathers go to an extent, family size, larger, they are more likely to use political connections. But what's actually maybe not so surprising in retrospect, but the ones that felt that sect or sectarianism very much defines their identity, and their connection, their family connection to religious leaders, were much more likely to use political connections. So this is an interesting way, because now it's actually interesting on two levels. One, we realize that finding a job in the private sector, by the way, this is all private sector jobs. So public sector is very clearly patronage will kick in, so that's very. But in private sector, what's telling us here that who's who in terms of uses political versus social, and the importance of religious leaders, which we have, frankly, has escaped us as middlemen, I guess, of sort, between voters, so what do we make out of this? How do we conceptualize this? How do we move forward? This remains to be further developed. So here are very quickly sort of the findings that I just said, so I'm not going to go through them. But the World Bank concludes earlier, as I said, that it reduces search costs, but doesn't maximize the matching skills. We argue it's even much more than that. We argue, in fact, it sorts the labor markets, it sorts the meaning of elections, it shows how prevalent sectarianism is, and basically, the point being is that creating jobs in the private sector is not purely an economic problem. You have to look at it from a political economy perspective to understand it. So it's not about simply, creating sort of jobs from an economic perspective, building skills or improving, the labor supply. Okay, so I'm going to skip the decentralization issue because I'd like to move to the question two, because I go on here and talk about decentralization. But we do maybe very quickly show, we're interested on how we can improve and understand the challenge of decentralization. And what we're working on here, again, three major studies that we're working on, how to sort of improve the grant system, the local taxes, and how municipalities perform. But that brings us into the whole issue of, how do you measure performance? So I'm going to skip that. So we've attempted to do that through a survey of municipalities. And here I must say, when we were doing the survey, let me highlight this, we were doing it with the Ministry of Interior. And just to go back here, we were looking at obviously performance, or measuring performance in one way or another, looking at the administration, looking at finance, and looking at governance. So we designed a questionnaire, and we showed them, and we're going over them, and said, okay, we're fine with this, we're fine with this, we're fine with this. This, why do you need it? I was like, what do you mean, what do we need? This is the most important thing. It's like the output, the service delivery. They said, no, ignore it. I was like, what do you mean ignore it? This is the key pillar, the most important pillar. So we had a battle, and I was convinced that you can never measure it. I was like, look, I'm sure I'll get it wrong, but let's try, So I won, and I did it, and we got what we got in terms of what services they do, in terms of having master plan and garden, and it's interesting, there's variation. It's not all like who does what and so forth. And then we sort of plotted these things, and we saw, oh wow, level of development is how rich is the region where the municipality belongs in terms of, and this is a municipal performance index we sort of created, and we wanted to see, and it's very interesting. We always get these things, which tells you like even the rich ones, there's a whole major variation. It's not clear like as you grow, if you're a richer area, you perform better. And then we looked at revenue per household as a measure to see, and it's also not very clear here at all. And we look at the collection, in terms of collecting and so forth. Some very rich areas again. Sorry, I keep on getting closer. I forget that happens. So some rich municipalities are actually doing a poor job in collecting taxes, and we're looking at that of why is this case. And then we do some regressions, and we wanted to sort of control and look at sectarian fragmentation, which in the literature is very common that you control or you look at it. And following Alasina's work on this and others in Africa or even in the US looks at the more heterogeneous or mixed the community is, the less services you provide and so forth. So when I asked the Ministry of Interior for the data on this, they accused me of inciting civil war. I was like, look, I'm not interested if the Shia do a better job than the Sunnis. All I want to know if you're mixed community versus homogeneous. No way, they wouldn't give me that data. So we got our hands on this book that has drawn Lebanon into little squares. Each square is 100 people, and based on registered population, and the different color. Blue is Maronite, green is Greek, all that. And I had a wonderful researcher who survived this at the center, who actually started counting each one. We created, we counted the data, we created an index, and now we have for each municipality what sort of sectarian mix on the CASA level, on municipality level, and we were able to run this to see to get a sense of positive, negative. You see it's all sort of negative, but at least we wanted to get a sense of that. Now we're moving on to doing some work on municipal unions, but learning from our, and then I'm going to move to job creation. And I think this is very much the Harvard product space. This is how you've seen this before, right? Right, and I think this is very much Harvard. Yeah. Harvard's work.
Houseman, is it?
Mm. So we actually use this for our work on job creation, and we show here in Lebanon in 2000 what happened, and in 2008 you can see how you've got more sort of dots shine up, and we're trying to investigate here how Lebanon has been able to actually produce these goods despite the absence of industrial policy. And these goods seems to be very highly value added, 22,000 for countries of 13. And we link it to 75, and we realize that in fact, what's interesting about this, so we took the products, but we don't know the firms. We need to interview the firms. So we went to the Chamber of Commerce, we managed to get the list of the firms, we went to the customs, and in conclusion, we realized Lebanon's sort of ability to do that always comes from demand shock rather than productivity shock, which means essentially there's been no structural transformation. The sector gets these positive shocks in terms of open markets, and we don't capitalize on this. And we go down again. We realized this in the 60s, the same sort of cycle. So that's another thing that we're doing. In fact, now we're doing. Based on the product space, we're doing 10 Arab countries looking at the product space with 2 Harvard fellows. We're looking at sort of what strategic goods that they need to do. I can talk about that later on. The oil and thing is that we're doing another 3 studies. I'm going to skip that. And we're doing some work on instability. Here we're asked by the Lebanese army suddenly discovered SCPS. It's very strange to get a call from the Lebanese army, the research department. I never knew they had a research. I was invited to come up, and I was so eager to go. And I actually went to have a building next to the Ministry of Defense. And you walk in, and so seriously, I mean, it's just, okay, all wearing uniform, but talking the think tank language, preparing conference. Who's going to be the speaker? They're talking to who's going to be the moderator? What do we have? I was like, we publish this in Arabic, we publish it in English, and all some things that I'm like, and they're all wearing uniform. It was very, very strange. I can talk about that. So the Lebanese looking at, the British embassy has helped Lebanon establish towers on the Syrian-Lebanese border to prevent also bad things from happening. So here we sort of did a quick study on that, taking treatment groups and a control group to get a sense of the impact of that. Tower. It's 45. Literally a tower on the border between Lebanon and Syria to prevent smuggling, terrorism, weapons, and all that. They're sort of big things. With a bunker. Binoculars, huge, they can sort of monitor the area. So we send a team to do surveys of citizens, see the perception of the tower and the perception of the state, perception of the army, and sort of if the tower has actually impacted that or not. So, yeah. So to recap on this, so I think it's just to, what each study does for us is that political representation, I think it sort of says how much we need a better framework to understand something, and I'm talking about the political economy framework here. On decentralization, how we need good measurements to really understand why some municipalities are performing better. Job creation, I think it's important to engage stakeholders. I'm going to talk about that very quickly in the next question. And taking initiative with policymakers, and I'll be speaking about that. I'll skip it here and move to this. So here, we have essentially what the system looks like. We've got let's say a government, agencies, the ministry, the council of ministers, the parliament, policy outcomes. And I must say the center. So how has the center been able to go to my second question, influence policy? And I think in '97, the center has been very successful in lobbying for municipal elections. It's actually the first time ever that the government extends the mandate of municipal councils. So the LCP asked with LADI, which is the Lebanese Association for Civil Society Organization, and 100 other ones, they actually put together a whole campaign, and they managed to get the government to reverse this policy. This is very, very, in fact, very important to understand how we did it, how we were able to take advantage of intra-elite conflict. I think that politicians have a different view, and we were able to exploit that. The Prime Minister and the President wanted it, the Speaker of the House did not want it. So there was a sort of a moment there that civil society has been able to penetrate. But the civil society has been able to penetrate because civil society, in fact, was working so hard on this way before. Now, in 2005, I should say, the next time we were able to influence policy was when the government set up a commission to actually draft the law, and 3 of the members were from the center. So that's a great way to say, okay, after studying the topic for many, many years, you're invited to contribute to the drafting of the law. In 2012, I should say, we're invited again by the Parliament here to work with the Parliament on developing a municipal finance framework, which I actually myself worked on. We helped them out and put it together. I don't think it went very far, to be very honest. In 2013, the government decides to set up another committee to draft a decentralization law, which I also been involved in. Which is very interesting. I'll be happy over the Q&A talk about how that works and it evolved. And more recently, what we've done, and let me just say, we've shifted here, if you notice, and let me just maybe. I would say there are 3 categories of ways of thinking about this. One is that in 1997, we lobbied for this. In these all 3 initiatives, it was by invitation. So we've become known to be the experts in this. The governments invite us to come and participate. So we're always sort of, potentially waiting for the moment where we can contribute to something, to the initiative we're working on, that the moment comes. And the last one is we've taken the initiative and we went up to them. In fact, on the oil and gas, we've applied for a grant, we got it, and the first thing I did, I said, okay, instead of me and the center work on this whole oil and gas thing and prepare policy papers, and then we invite the Minister of Energy or whatever, whoever comes and cuts the ribbon and comes and gives a half an hour speech and disappears. You know what I mean? We said, let's get them involved from day one. So I've decided not to proceed with this project until I get those people on board. And I've communicated with the LPA and the Lebanese Petroleum Administration, which is a technocratic group of people. And surprisingly, they were very positive. So now we signed an MOU, we're working together, we're holding these roundtables together. And the policy papers that we're doing before, we've actually commissioned them to also with different experts. They've reviewed them, they've given comments on them. And the idea is to get them to work with us and try to influence policy from day one of the project, not from the last day of the project when we're finishing it up and we call them to come. And same with the with the Association for Lebanese Industrialists. When I went to see Namat Fadim, who's the head of the Ali, and I showed him what we're doing in the product space, he was totally amazed by it. And I was like, okay. And I was actually going to tell him we should work together, and he said, oh, why don't we work together? Lovely, it's music to our ears. So now we're signing an MOU with them to actually work on that. So just to sort of end on this, so three ways of approaching this is by building a strong coalition, which we did in 1997, by invitation in these 3 times, and by initiating sort of contacts. I think I'll end right here, maybe, and sort of not to take a lot more time and get your feedback and questions you have. So thank you.